good news. After months of headlines promising a war on saturated fat breakthrough, the new US Dietary Guidelines have arrived. So is butter finally back? Well, sort of. It is January 7th that I'm recording, and the reason I waited until specifically this day is because this is when the US Dietary Guidelines were finally released for the next 5 years. Now, typically the dietary guidelines come before December 31st, but they were delayed for whatever reason. I don't really follow the news that closely, so I'm sure it's been mentioned in the news, and I just don't know why. But I just know that these guidelines were delayed. So finally, on January 7th, we are seeing some information here, some official information from the U.S. government. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., of course, most people know, was kind of spearheading this effort, and he was really fighting against the war on saturated fat, because for decades we've been taught that saturated fat causes heart disease. And now, with modern research, especially unbiased research, we are realizing it's not really about the saturated fat, it's more about the refined carbohydrates. Now, ironically, since we've been told saturated fat is unhealthy, we've had a significant increase in chronic disease, especially heart disease, over the past several decades, because we've been cutting out fat and eating more refined carbohydrates, and it's actually the seed oils as well. So we've been going more toward what we thought were healthy fats, but they were actually causing us more health problems in the long run. So this week's episode is not a guest episode, it's a solo episode with just me talking, but I feel like it's an important topic to discuss because I'm going to go over exactly what the guidelines are, in case you don't want to look them up and read them yourself. But also, I'm going to offer my professional opinion on some of these points. I do think overall it is an improvement from what it was before, but it's not perfect. There's always room for improvement. So I'll get into the details on that once we get into the episode. Before we get into today's episode, though, I wanted to share one quick thing, and that is I have been really frustrated as a holistic healthcare provider with a conventional license. I have noticed that a lot of the online directories for finding healthcare providers are biased to conventional providers. Now, I've been so frustrated with that I've started my own directory. This is for all holistic healthcare practitioners. So not just for therapists, not just for nutritionists, but it might include massage therapists, naturopathic doctors, functional doctors, dentists, chiropractors. If you are interested in checking it out, it is holisticcarenetwork.com. If you happen to be a practitioner, I am offering 50% off the subscription rate for having a profile for the next 6 months. So that's until June. So definitely go there. You'll see the coupon code when you go to the homepage, holisticcarenetwork.com. Welcome to the Real Food Mental Health Podcast, where we explore the powerful connection between mental and physical health. My name is Cody Cox, a holistic nutritional psychotherapist, and I'm here to guide you on a journey to true wellness, mind, body, and spirit. If you're tired of quick fixes and want real solutions that address the root cause, you're in the right place. Let's get started on your path to lasting wellness. Now, Robert F. Kennedy promised to end the war on saturated fats, and that's been something that he's talked about a lot. Unfortunately, we're not quite seeing that in the new US Dietary Guidelines, although it's a little bit mixed because they are still recommending keeping saturated fat at or below 10% of your daily calories. But the reason it's a little bit mixed is they are also saying, they're redefining what a healthy fat actually is, and they are recommending eating butter and beef tallow. And I don't think they say lard in here, but I think lard should also be included in that recommendation. Now, the reason that is confusing, though, is because typically butter, tallow, and lard are actually pretty high in saturated fat. So if you're following that recommendation, how on earth are you supposed to keep that under 10% of your daily calories? I don't really know. I mean, it's either one or the other, in my opinion. You can't really do both. And so, unfortunately, I think that's going to mean in public schools and prisons and other government programs, we're still going to see a lot of dependence on seed oils because they are legally required to adhere to the US Dietary Guidelines, which means they are still going to be shooting for under 10% of daily calories in saturated fat. They might still use some butter and some tallow, but I think it's going to be very minimal. So at first glance, when we look at, there's an official PDF that the government put out today, January 7th, and we look at the front page, it's actually an inversed food pyramid. So if you're as old as I am, you probably remember that they used to teach the food pyramid back in the 90s. In fact, I think that was ended in the early 2000s. Maybe it was 2005. But in the 90s, they were teaching the food pyramid where the base of the pyramid, which is the larger portion of the pyramid, was grains and starches, which I think was really, really bad advice. I was never one to watch the show South Park, but I do remember that there was an episode where basically they said you should flip the food pyramid upside down. And that's what the new US Dietary Guidelines are doing. They have flipped it upside down to where grains are still at the bottom. I'm not really sure why they oriented it this way, but they kept grains at the bottom, but now the bottom is the smaller part of the pyramid, where the larger part at the top contains protein, dairy, and what they call healthy fats. And like I said, they are redefined to mostly being animal fats or not fried fats. So you've got protein, dairy, and healthy fats, and also fruits and vegetables. I think that's really good advice overall. We should all be focused on eating real food. So typically that means meat and vegetables and occasionally some fruit. I think especially if you don't live near the equator, fruit should be treated more as a healthy dessert rather than as like a main part of your breakfast or something. We have a major problem with obesity in the United States. About 70% of American adults are obese. That's a problem. I mean, I live in northern Utah. I see some of that, actually. Maybe I'm so used to that I don't even notice anymore, unless somebody's morbidly obese, but there definitely are a lot of people walking around who are carrying more weight than they should. Now, am I implying that weight is the only indicator of health? No, because there are some people, in fact, a lot of people who are either underweight or they have a quote-unquote healthy BMI, but they probably still have health problems. It's like 92% of Americans have a metabolic disorder, and 88% of Americans have dysglycemia or dysregulated blood sugar. America spends more money on healthcare than any other country in the world, yet we are the sickest than any other country in the world. And maybe it's not so much every other country in the world, but every other developed country in the world. 1 in 3 teenagers has pre-diabetes. And we used to think of diabetes type 2 being more of a condition that we suffer from as we get older. So typically that was something that the elderly developed, but now we know it's not really an issue of age, it's an issue of health. Unfortunately, we are to the point that now even 5-year-olds are being diagnosed with diabetes type 2. That's pretty messed up. Now, chronic disease costs greater than 90% of what we spend on healthcare. 90%. Now, I did mention a minute ago that we spend more on healthcare than most other countries in the world, maybe even all other countries in the world. And when we're spending 90% of that on chronic disease, that tells us that we're doing something wrong, especially in terms of prevention. Diet and lifestyle, that's the prevention, and most of us just simply aren't doing it right. Ironically, doing it right actually takes very little effort. You just have to get your mind out of the idea of buying products and go for real food that nature intended. So enough statistics. I'm going to go more now into exactly what the dietary guidelines tell us to eat. Just kind of the general overview. And here's what we have. So less than or equal to 10% of daily calories of saturated fat. So that has not changed from the previous US dietary guidelines. Essentially, they are reinforcing moderation. I think that 10% is too low. I think it's impossible to keep it below 10%. Unless you're only eating one meal a day, if you are also eating things like butter, tallow, lard, and other sources of saturated fat. So ironically, they do recommend that you eat healthy fats such as butter and tallow, and so it's just one or the other. So I personally am not going to worry about that 10% guideline. I'm just going to eat my butter. So that's really kind of the main one. I did hear some speculation that they chose not to change that because of political reasons. Now, apparently they were worried that if they had changed the saturated fat cap, it would just be the major topic of headlines across all news media. And I can definitely see that because saturated fat has been very controversial. People are just flat out afraid of it. And so if they were to say, oh, make it 40% of your daily calories, I think people would be outraged. And I have learned in my studies, so I studied criminology at one point, if it bleeds, it leads. Essentially what that means is if something is just outrageous or grotesque, it's going to be a leading story in the media. So the media really loves to use that kind of stuff. So they purposely chose not to change the saturated fat recommendation because they didn't want that to be the major headlines. I guess they were just fearful that people would ignore the other recommendations, which I'm about to get to. Okay, so onto the protein. Interestingly, they are encouraging red meat now, where in previous decades they have discouraged us from eating red meat, so beef has definitely gotten a bad rap, and so has pork. Unfairly so, too, because beef and pork are actually healthy foods. So now the US is recommending that we eat red meat again. I think it's important here to note we have also been encouraged to go for the lean meats. So if we are buying ground beef, for example, we've been encouraged to look for the lean ground beef. And I think it's really just that fear of saturated fat issue that has kind of led us to believe that lean meat is better. With the new guidelines, they don't say anything about getting lean meat. You're just eating meat in general, and that's not a bad thing. So there's your protein. Dairy, they recommend full fat, unsweetened dairy 3 times a day. I'm not really big on the numbers, but if you are a numbers person, they do say specifically 3 servings per day, whatever that means. I mean, a serving could be a whole bowl full of yogurt, or it could be 2 spoonfuls of yogurt. Who knows? I think serving size is really a matter of opinion. So that's dairy. Fruits and vegetables. I don't feel like that's really that different, but 3 vegetables, 2 fruits of servings per day in their whole forms. And that's That's one that I'm pleasantly surprised to see. They do say to limit 100% juice. And why is that? Because 100% juice really is just sugar water. Yeah, it comes from natural sources, but because the fiber is taken out and because it's usually not very fresh, the vitamins are pretty much gone from it too. So in the end, you're just getting really concentrated sugar water that you're putting into your body. Really not good for your insulin or your blood glucose, and ultimately not good for metabolic health or just general health. So they do recommend that you minimize drinking juice, or at least dilute it with water, which sounds pretty gross to me. I prefer just to not drink juice, except maybe on a very rare occasion I'll have a small amount. But when it comes to fruit, get them in their whole form. Eat the apple rather than drinking a glass of apple juice. Whole grains, I think this is probably the biggest change, honestly. So they do recommend less whole grains than before. 2 to 4 servings per day, prioritizing fiber. Now, I think that is not really the best advice. You're going to get more fiber from vegetables, non-starchy vegetables, than you are from grains. So don't think you're getting a lot of fiber from grains. If you are eating grains, make sure they're whole. That means unrefined, and you're keeping it pretty low to 2 to 4 servings per day. Healthy fats, like I said, they kind of redefined what healthy fats are. So butter, tallow, lard, those actually are healthy fats, despite what we've been led to believe for the last several decades. Other ones are olive oil, and I would say olive oil is healthy only if it's raw and extra virgin and from a good fresh source. So hopefully it hasn't been sitting on your shelf for a couple years, because if that's the case, it's probably rancid and it's not a healthy oil. So you want it to be fresh, you want it to be raw. Nuts, also preferably raw, even more preferably if they are sprouted or soaked. Seeds, same thing. Avocado is a good source of healthy fat. Fatty fish is a good source of healthy fat. We do want to limit, so moving into the next category, what foods are we trying to limit? Again, we are limiting the refined carbohydrates or refined food in general. Honestly, it's just, I tell everybody, avoid food that's made in a factory and go more for the food that is produced on a farm. If you can't reproduce a food in your kitchen with simple ingredients, then you probably shouldn't be eating it. So we do want to limit added sugars, especially refined sugars. I prefer to use a raw honey or a maple syrup instead of refined sugar, but even that is sugar, so it's going to spike your insulin and your glucose. So if you're worried about that, you definitely want to limit even the honey and the maple syrup, as well as fruit sugars, fructose. We're avoiding ultra-processed foods. Like I said, avoid it if it's made in a factory. That's kind of the general rule. And any sweeteners that really have no nutritional value. I don't necessarily agree with that one. I think stevia actually is okay. It doesn't provide nutrition, but it's not bad for you either. Here's an interesting one, sodium. We have been taught for decades that sodium is bad for our heart. Well, in the new guidelines, it still gives you a limit of 2,300 milligrams per day of sodium, but it does say that sodium and electrolytes, technically sodium is an electrolyte, but they are essential for hydration. We do need to have sodium, as well as potassium, magnesium, and a number of other things. So I recommend that you eat an unrefined salt, because if you do, it kind of depends on what kind of salt it is, but typically you're getting over 80 different minerals, micronutrients, and it's not just sodium chloride. If you are having unrefined salt, it is actually very hard to get too much sodium in your diet. So I definitely recommend that. If you're just going to go for sodium chloride, I think this is really where the danger is. That's what we call refined salt, or just plain table salt. That's the cheap stuff that everybody uses, or most everybody uses. And that's where you possibly could get too much sodium, and it could cause some problems. Highly processed foods are high in sodium, or just plain old adding your cheap salt to food in general is going to give you too much sodium. So I recommend using the unrefined whenever possible. I'm happy to see that they are recommending limiting alcohol. I don't think this was in here before, but essentially, as a holistic nutritionist, I know that alcohol is a neurotoxin. It's toxic in other ways too, but essentially it's a toxin that we should be avoiding, just like the refined sugar. So I know that there are a lot of people who swear by like wine being a superfood or a health food, or a little bit of alcohol here and there doesn't hurt, but it is a toxin. And I'm glad to see in the new dietary guidelines that they're saying limit alcohol, but personally I just avoid it completely. And along the lines of very popular beverages, I don't think it says anything about caffeine or drinking coffee, but the caffeine in coffee actually can cause some problems too, particularly with your adrenal health. So if you are a person who is very stressed and anxious all the time, you probably should get away from the caffeine, even if maybe it's not coffee, maybe it's energy drinks, or maybe you're drinking a soda or something, but the caffeine will make you feel more stressed and anxious. So that is another thing to be aware of, even though they don't mention it in the new guidelines. I am happy to see recommendations for special populations such as infants, children, pregnant and lactating women, older adults, vegans, vegetarians, and people with chronic disease, which honestly is like 88% of America. I'm not going to get into the specifics on those special populations, but I'm glad to see that those are there, because a lot of people just continue eating the same way that they always do, especially if they are conceiving, pregnant, or lactating, breastfeeding women. They don't realize that eating healthy food actually has an impact on not only their health, but the health of their child. And so it's nice to see some guidelines in there. Now, I'm going to get it more into my opinions. Counseling, so as far as mental health goes, with the saturated fat, that really is essential for brain health. And so if you are worried about improving brain health in a natural way, definitely eat some saturated fat. I honestly would even forego the 10% recommendation from the new guidelines and just focus on eating saturated fat until you feel satisfied. Not necessarily binging or going crazy with it, but just eat it until you still feel satisfied, because your body knows more than what some official dietary guidelines will tell you. So your body will say, I'm done, when it's done. So make sure you're getting that saturated fat. I already gave you some examples: butter, tallow, lard, coconut oil is another one. So yeah, make sure you're getting that for brain health. As far as protein goes, I feel like what they give here is actually pretty decent, so I'm not really going to offer any specific opinion on that. It really kind of depends on what your goals are, but generally you want around 1 gram of protein per pound of ideal body weight per day. That is a lot for some people. But the reality is, I think most of us just simply aren't eating enough protein. I met somebody just yesterday, actually, who's getting close to 300 grams of protein per day, and I'm pretty sure he doesn't weigh that much, but I don't know how he can do that. That's more than I've ever eaten in a day. But generally, you want 1 gram of protein for every pound of ideal body weight. Overall, I think the new dietary guidelines are pretty good, actually. The biggest thing, which I think I've probably made clear at this point, is the saturated fat issue. And there might be like some minor details that I might disagree with. I haven't thoroughly read through it. In fact, I might just do that and offer some more specific details in a future episode. But as just a broad overview, though, it sounds like it's pretty good, especially because we have inversed the food pyramid. So eating whole grains instead of refined grains, I really like that they are using that language. Essentially what they're saying at the very top of the second page, so after the cover page, it says the message is simple: eat real food. And I've already defined what real food is for you. If you're listening to this podcast, hopefully you know what real food is, or maybe you're new and you're still trying to figure that out. But just go back to that rule of, was this made in a factory? If so, that means it's not a real food. It's an ultra-processed food. And if it was grown on a farm and can be reproduced in your kitchen with simple ingredients, then it's a real food. So essentially what that means is stick to meat, vegetables, fruit. Hopefully vegetables and fruits are in season. And whole grains that are properly prepared. What does properly prepared mean? Well, that usually means that it's fermented or soaked or sprouted. And yes, that is less convenient, but as you get used to eating that way, you're going to feel so much better and be so much more satisfied with eating real food, even to the point, I've experienced this myself actually, especially like around the holidays. It's January 7th right now, and so it's just after Christmas, just after New Year's, and I do notice when I eat a holiday treat that I used to eat in my childhood that I loved, it's just not as good as I remember. And I think part of it might be because of inflation. Manufacturers have changed their recipes and stuff. So the quality might be a little bit less, but I think it's also just that my palate has changed. I'm so used to eating whole, healthy foods that my body just is kind of disappointed with stuff that's not whole and healthy. So I challenge you to get into that yourself. Try to eat more whole, real foods by following the US Dietary Guidelines. Maybe ignore the saturated fat bit. If you're trying to go keto, you would be limiting your fruit and probably eliminating completely the grains and any starchy vegetables, but it kind of depends on what your health goals are as to which diet you're following, but in general, just eat whole foods. It's that simple. Essentially, what we're trying to do is mimic what nature would provide. And so if there's anything that's far removed from nature, it's probably going to be unhealthy for us, not just in terms of food, but in terms of lifestyle habits too. So for example, I'm just sitting inside staring at a screen as I record this right now, and that's kind of far from nature. That's not really what our bodies are designed to be doing. And so I would challenge you to try to make your lifestyle a little bit more in line with nature and biologically appropriate as well. Now, if you're listening to this and you're thinking, oh, I know I should be eating whole foods, but it's just so hard, I have good news for you. I lead a support group, which actually is kind of an educational group as well. It's called Restart. If you've listened to my podcast for a while, you've probably heard me talk about it. But I'm starting a new class on January 12th. That's this coming Monday, if you're listening to this podcast pretty shortly after it's published. It is this coming Monday, January 12th at 10 a.m. Mountain Time. For more information, go to beavercreekwellness.com/restart. This will be a small group. It will be online, and essentially it's designed to guide you through a whole food sugar detox. So it's just going to provide some education on what to expect with a sugar detox, but what's cool about it is it's a support group too. So other people in the group are going to be on that same journey of transitioning to whole foods, cutting out the sugars, and potentially, in fact, most likely feeling healthier over the course of 5 weeks. So anyway, overall, I really like the new US Dietary Guidelines. Now, I did not become a dietitian because of the fact that most dietitians aren't taught this stuff in school. They are taught basically the old food pyramid where it's okay to eat a bunch of carbohydrates. In fact, they have even pushed refined carbohydrates, or so I've heard, and that's a major problem. But I really wanted to become a dietitian, and I chose not to because I did not want that kind of an education. I wanted an education that was unbiased and not influenced by major food corporations. And I'm so glad to finally start seeing that hopefully become a little bit more mainstream, especially with these new dietary guidelines from the federal government. Now, how are people going to respond to this? I don't know yet. It was just published today. I can see maybe some dietitians and other quote unquote experts are probably going to go to social media and news outlets and start complaining. But from my perspective, I consider most of these recommendations to be very, very good. And chances are, if you're listening to this show, you probably agree with me. If you don't, feel free to send me a message, leave a comment, do what you need to do to get a conversation going, because I would love to maybe include some comments on future episodes. So make sure you leave a comment if you feel like you have something substantial to share. Real Food Mental Health is for informational and entertainment purposes only. I do not necessarily agree with all of the views shared by guests. The information presented on this podcast is not intended to replace any medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. While I am a healthcare provider, I am not your provider. Always seek the advice of an appropriate healthcare practitioner with any personal questions you may have regarding a medical condition. Never disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you've heard on this podcast. Reliance on information provided by this podcast is at your own risk.